The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
A summer of domestic unrest in Iran, news of a previously undisclosed nuclear enrichment facility, and now high-level negotiations with the Islamic Republic. What right does the world have to step in, and what's at risk internationally? We'll discuss the technical and political issues swirling around Iran's nuclear program with two experts on nuclear proliferation, next on Office Hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Iran says it is developing civilian nuclear energy, but other countries fear it is racing to produce a nuclear bomb and are demanding that it transfer its stockpile of nuclear material outside the country. With me today to discuss Iran's nuclear program are two scholars from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Andy Kydd is a professor in the political science department. He teaches international relations and has written extensively on international security issues and nuclear proliferation. Paul Wilson is a professor in the engineering physics department with a research focus on nuclear fuel cycles and proliferation. He is a member of the American Nuclear Society and is affiliated with the Wisconsin Institute of Nuclear Systems. Andy, Paul, thanks for joining us on Office Hours today. Paul, let me start with you from the engineering or scientific perspective of what it actually takes to build a nuclear bomb.
So there's two main ways to do this. The way that is of interest maybe today is the way Iran is potentially pursuing, and that is to acquire some uranium, mine it from the ground or buy it from another country, enrich it in some sort of system to change how potent it is from the natural state to a much more potent state, and then form it into the shape that's needed for a bomb. It's in many respects a relatively simple process, and has not been the process we'd be most worried about historically. The other way is to use plutonium. In that case, you actually have to build a reactor to create the plutonium, then you have to separate it and form that into a much more complicated system.
So when you say you mine the uranium, get it out of the ground, and then enrich it to make it more potent, what are you actually doing there?
So uranium comes in two forms, in two pieces, and when we mine it out of the ground naturally, we call them isotopes. One of them is abundant. Most of the uranium is the less potent form, the uranium-238. The less than 1% of it is uranium-235. To make a weapon, you need much more than 90% of it to be uranium-235. So you have to get rid of all the uranium-238 and increase the amount of uranium-235. We do that with, we did it in the United States in the Manhattan Project era with really large systems that were very energy intensive and very difficult to hide. The modern way of doing it around the world, in the United States and other countries, and what Iran is using, is the centrifuge system, where we spin it in these very fast-moving centrifuges to separate the heavy from the light.
Andy, so no secret that Iran has uranium, no secret that they've enriched that uranium to a certain level. What particularly, specifically, are they in violation of now?
Well, it's no secret now, but it has been secret for a while, and that's really the rub. Iran is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as a non-nuclear weapons state. There are 5 states which are nuclear weapon states allowed to have nuclear weapons in that treaty, and the rest are not allowed to have nuclear weapons. But non-nuclear weapon states under the treaty are allowed to do a lot of nuclear things, including enrich uranium. So that per se is not the violation. The problem arises with the fact that Iran didn't come clean about what it was doing. It built this enrichment plant at Natanz and began to put the centrifuge in it before it was discovered or announced, and it was discovered by external sources. And so that created a well of distrust between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency and the broader international community about what the purpose of that enrichment plant was. And so as a result of that, the UN Security Council prohibited Iran from enriching uranium. So they're in violation of those resolutions, not the more fundamental non-proliferation treaty obligations, which is what they, of course, point to in their assertions of their right to enrich uranium.
So when the Iranians say, we have the right to enrich uranium, we have the right to nuclear energy, that's correct. What got them into trouble was the fact that the only reason why we knew they were doing that is because they got discovered, and so the world then says, well.
Right. Yeah. It raises certainly the specter that this is for some other purpose than the stated purpose, which is to provide fuel for their nuclear reactors. So that really is the problem. They have an argument on their side, which is under the NPT they are allowed to enrich uranium, as many other countries do. but specifically the way they went about doing it generated this consequence of the Security Council resolution against them. And so that's the legal basis for the international action against them at this point.
So there's ongoing negotiations about Iran shipping out a significant part of its enriched uranium to another country, probably Russia. And so you hear the figure that Iran has somewhere around 3,000 pounds of enriched uranium. What does that mean in bombs, in potential?
So in terms of what they have right now, the uranium is enriched to 5%, which means directly as it is, it can't be used to make a bomb. 3,000 pounds is, it's not enough to, it's enough if you were to enrich it further to make a bomb. So if you were to enrich this 3,000 pounds up to the level you need to make a bomb, they would have enough material already to do that. The proposal right now is to take most of that material out to Russia, enrich it a little bit more, in fact, and return it in the form of fuel for their research reactor. The benefit of this, despite the fact they'd be getting free enrichment out of it, the benefit is it would be in a form that would be very difficult for them to turn into a weapons program again. And it would also be very easy to monitor what they were doing with this, because if they didn't use it for their research reactor, we would know, because their research reactor would not be operating.
Please stay with us in Office Hours, and we will continue our discussion of Iran and its search for nuclear energy or nuclear weapons.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
Hit it!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours, where I'm joined by Andy Kydd and Paul Wilson talking about nuclear energy, nuclear weapons in Iran. Andy, so the basic logic of this possible plan, as outlined by Paul, is take this uranium that potentially could be enriched to nuclear weapons grade, take it out to Russia, enrich it to something that can then be used for energy, medical, scientific purposes. And I think anyone's saying what you're basically doing is you're buying yourself time. But there's some debate about how much time you're actually buying with that, correct?
Right, yes. Well, there's a number of issues there. The material shipped out to Russia, if it were not shipped out in bulk, if it were shipped out little by little, could be replaced essentially by current production from the uranium enrichment facility that they already have, which would mean that the stockpile that they have right now essentially would still be available for other uses if they wanted to do something else with it, or just put it aside for later use. So that's one concern that people have with it.
Are we sure they only have 3,000 pounds?
We're not sure necessarily. That's what they say they have. But the pattern with Iran historically has been that they admit to what we can prove and don't go much further than that in terms of being forthcoming with the International Atomic Energy Agency or other international bodies. And so that's what they say they have. People have raised questions about whether they have more. No one knows if they have more for sure, but that's an open question, certainly.
Paul, I mean, how difficult is it to hide making another 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 pounds of uranium? Obviously, we have intelligence assets and there's inspectors on the ground, but is that something that could plausibly be hidden?
Right, so I think it could be hidden pretty easily. The plant would have to be running and we'd be able to detect whether it was actually operating. But I mean, 3,000 pounds of uranium would fit under this table. And so the actual total quantity of uranium isn't very much. And so it's easy to do that in small amounts. And one of the big advantages of the centrifuge system is that you can do it without tapping a lot of electricity from your grid and needing a lot of energy, whereas the old system that we used to have was much more energy intensive.
So one tell, for, not asking you to be the CIA analyst here, but one tell would have been if you're seeing a tremendous amount of energy going into one town, one city, one remote desert outpost, you'd say, something strange is going on there. But the centrifuges
Right.
It could be in a
centrifuges
room.
still require some energy, but it's much less. And in fact, that's why prior to about 10 years ago, we weren't really worried about countries like Iran using enrichment to make a bomb, because they didn't have the centrifuge technology. So the access to the centrifuge technology, largely through the AQ-Khan network, is what's tipped the balance really on how easy it is to make a nuclear weapon.
Andy, talk to me a little bit about that. So it was the Khan network out of Pakistan was really a significant thing, because then it enabled these countries to do this more secretly, more quickly, more efficiently.
It was very significant. Pakistan, of course, developed nuclear weapons itself, led by AQ-Khan. And they received help from China, in turn, Chinese nuclear designs and materials. And then AQ-Khan went out more or less freelance and bought and sold on the international market with other countries nuclear materials, nuclear designs, and a key component, as Paul just said, was centrifuges and centrifuge parts. These things have turned up in Libya, they went to Iran, other places. Now, it doesn't mean that getting that means you've got the bomb or even close to it. You still need to have the expertise to manufacture these and to set them up and run them, which Libya didn't even come close to having, for instance. So you need a receptive environment, a capable environment, and Iran has had that environment, and so that ingredient was crucial there.
Okay. And we're going to continue our discussion of Iran's environment and what in the Iranian environment might have brought them back to the negotiating table in recent days and weeks. Please stay with us on Office Hours. Welcome back to Office Hours. I'm joined by Andy Kydd and Paul Wilson. Andy, let me turn to you. Lots happening in Iran internally. What's generally considered a fraudulent election in Iran, and then unusual domestic unrest. Has that played into the Iranians coming back to the table, or was it simply that their new site got discovered?
The elections and the turmoil has probably played a role. Unfortunately, it's probably not a very good role, because what has happened is that the Iranian regime, which has always been kind of a balance between the Islamic fundamentalist side and the Republic side of the Islamic Republic, it seems to be listing heavily towards the Islamic fundamentalist side of things. And the security apparatus, the Republican guards, appear to be cracking down in a pretty serious way. That by itself wouldn't bode well for being forthcoming internationally over the nuclear issue or anything else. However, it has generated a moment of vulnerability for the regime, and they may wish to buy some time by making some tactical concessions at the international level as a result of that. But I think one of the biggest factors is the discovery of this new site where they hope to build another enrichment plant, and the surprising way in which that was revealed at the G20 summit last month really rallied a lot of international condemnation of Iran, and I think took them aback a bit, and that's why they decided to allow inspectors to see the site, and that's why they may be a bit more forthcoming now on the negotiations about shipping the fuel out of the country.
Lots of different sorts of possible sanctions, short of a military strike, being talked about with Iran. And there are sanctions on Iran now that try and restrict funds and technical expertise and hardware. Can those be effective? Can those be stringent enough? Is it possible? Do they already have the information, already have the technology?
So I think that they probably have enough technology to keep doing what they're doing now. The only thing that they would really need potentially from outside, and I'm not sure if their domestic resources, is the natural uranium itself. They probably have enough of that as well to really keep going for the time being. It's hard to see how targeted sanctions on that nuclear know-how and nuclear technology are going to have a big effect at this point. I think it really would take sort of broader sanctions to have a bigger effect on their economy or a bigger effect on their political system.
But then it's this paradox or conundrum, because if we did more general sanctions, that would probably hurt the middle class and the folks who are the most likely to reform in Iran.
Well, broader economic sanctions have been tried before and haven't often worked in this context. We tried them with Iraq for many years, and one could argue that it backfired seriously in that case. It harmed Iraq and harmed worst, the poorest and the most vulnerable in Iraq. That played into the hands of Islamist propaganda against the United States. It was trumpeted by bin Laden and others without actually affecting Saddam Hussein's behavior that much. And it's not clear that going down that road in Iran would affect the regime that much. If the sanctions could be more closely targeted towards the Iranian leadership individually and as an institution, that might be helpful. But general sanctions that simply target the ordinary people of Iran, who are essentially a majority would seem to be anti-regime already, it's not clear that that would be useful.
Okay. When we come back on office hours, I know, Andy, you've done a lot of work on trust, and we're going to talk about whether these initial negotiations have the potential to lead to other sorts of agreements, and also talk about what the implications might be if Iran, in fact, does get a nuclear bomb. So please stay with us on office hours as we continue our discussion on Iran.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours, where we're discussing Iran and its nuclear intentions. So, Andy, speaking of intentions, the current negotiations going on now have some fairly modest goals, but I've heard them described as a test of Iran's intentions, a first stage in possible negotiations. How do you read that as someone who's studied and studies negotiations?
It is a test, in a sense, of Iranian intentions. There's no doubt about that. They are hoping that Iran will cooperate in this adventure of exploring the fuel to Russia, and that small step could lead on to bigger steps that involve a greater amount of trust between the two parties. Right now, there's not very much trust at all between the two parties. And so there is an established view that you start, when you're trying to build trust, and you clearly have a trust problem here, you need to start small, and then build up gradually with greater and greater agreements, much as the Cold War, for instance, ended between the United States and the Soviet Union through a series of increasingly important agreements and arms control negotiations. That's what people would like to see in this case. It's important to realize, however, that there have been a lot of negotiations with Iran on this issue. The Europeans, throughout the Bush administration, have been negotiating with Iran on nuclear proliferation and enrichment, and have struck agreements only to see those agreements fall to the wayside. And so for a lot of Europeans, they feel we've already been to this table a number of times, and we feel we've already got a fair amount of information about Iranian trustworthiness. So ironically, actually, another aspect of the trust building that's going on here via these negotiations is American intentions. People want to see a good faith effort by the United States to try negotiations with Iran on this topic. For the previous administration, the United States basically subcontracted it to the Europeans. Now they want to see in a direct American role. They want to see the Americans trying diplomacy with Iran. If that were then to fail, the United States would then be in a better position to try more coercive strategies against Iran with more hope of mobilizing international support.
So when you say the Europeans have already seen this movie, in a sense, does that mean they're ready to go to that next step, or they want to see us convinced of that?
Some Europeans are ready to go to that next step. They would like,
which is counterintuitive to some folks, I would imagine.
Yes, exactly. It's an exact reversal of the roles from 2003 over Iraq. Here we have the Europeans being much more hard-charging, as the Americans sometimes like to say, on Iran, and France in particular getting into trouble about this. The Iranians actually don't want to talk to the French anymore because they've made so many aggressive statements. And the Americans have been pursuing diplomacy for a long time. We're allowing the Europeans to pursue diplomacy. And now the new Obama administration wants to continue that road for a while. But I think it's a necessary process to go through. I don't think the Obama administration could have come in without trying negotiations and tried to go directly to a military or even a hard economic sanctions approach.
So, Paul, you're obviously not a military expert or a military planner, and I'm not asking you to plan a military operation, but is it practical in the sense that if you knocked out the major Iranian nuclear enrichment facility, would that actually buy you time? What would that do?
I think it would buy you a lot of time, and it would maybe make some of those targeted sanctions more effective. Because if you were to actually able to destroy Natanz, where their major enrichment facility is right now, they would be not only out of the production capability, but they might be out of the centrifuges that were actually there. And acquiring new centrifuges or the material to make new centrifuges could be a big time issue for them. And so you could buy yourself a lot of time, I think, by taking out that facility. Now that all depends on how complete the new facility is and whether or not that's able to take over the burden.
Or a facility we don't know about.
Or a facility we don't know about.
And now, that is not a cost-free venture. What would be the implications of that if we were
of a military strike? Yeah, if you did a military strike on Natanz and whatever other targets they could find, yes, there would be costs associated with that. That would inflame anti-American opinion, especially in the Muslim world. You would have to deal with a lot of political repercussions there. Iran itself might take retaliatory measures, either directly on American forces in Iraq, for instance, indirectly through Hezbollah, which they support in Lebanon. There could be terrorist attacks sponsored by Iran. So far, Iran has not been a big sponsor of terrorist attacks against the United States. That could change. And so there could be a real response there.
We have about 45 seconds left. I want to put a quote up here from Hillary Clinton during the campaign, actually, in which Hillary Clinton says, in the next 10 years, during which they might foolishly consider launching an attack on Israel, we would be able to totally obliterate them. Implicitly assuming Iran's going to get the nuclear bomb, but basically making a classic deterrence. Okay, they're going to get it. If they do, we'll stop them from using it because we'll obliterate them if they do.
Yes, it's a curious quote because it's not clear that the United States has to play that role, certainly on behalf of Israel. Israel already has upwards of 200 nuclear weapons and the capacity to retaliate against any conceivable Iranian strike into the foreseeable future. So Israel can deter Iran on its own. It's really, to my mind, it's thinking about Iraq, thinking about Saudi Arabia. Those are the countries that we might need to try to extend a nuclear umbrella to vis-a-vis Iran.
Great. Paul, Andy, thanks for joining us. All our viewers out there, thanks for joining us and stopping by on Office Hours. Please join us next time.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.